former Navy SEAL named Stellan Cross sat hunched in the snow outside a small diner in Ashford Ridge, his shoulders rigid from the cold, but his hands trembling from something deeper. Beside him, Coda, his loyal German shepherd, thinner than he should be after days of wandering, looked up at him, waiting. Stellan reached into a worn paper bag and placed the last piece of food in front of the dog. Coda ate. He didn't. He just sat there, staring into nothing, like the war had never really left him. People walked past, some slowed down, some whispered, but no one stopped. Because a man like Stellan was easier to ignore than to understand. Until Harriet Vale, a 93-year-old woman with a steady gaze and quiet strength, stepped out of the diner. She didn't hesitate. She pulled out a chair and sat down in front of him as if he had never disappeared from the world. And what she said next didn't just make him pick up a fork, it pulled him back toward a life he had already given up on. If this story moves you, let me know where you're watching from. Share your thoughts, hit like, and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's keep spreading stories like this. Winter settled over Ashford Ridge, Colorado, like a quiet decision no one could argue with. Snow did not fall in violent gusts that night. It came down slow and steady, covering the narrow streets, the rooftops, and the empty parking lots in a soft, relentless silence. The mountains surrounding the town were barely visible behind a veil of gray, and the few streetlights that remained on cast long, dim reflections across the frozen pavement. Ashford Ridge was the kind of place where people knew each other, where doors stayed closed after dark, and where anything unfamiliar stood out immediately. Especially a man like Stellan Cross. Stellan Cross was 41 years old, tall at just over 6 feet, with the kind of build that suggested strength worn thin rather than lost. His shoulders were still broad, his posture still carried the faint discipline of a man trained to stay alert at all times, but there was a visible heaviness in the way he held himself, like something inside him had been pressing down for too long. His dark brown hair was cut short in a practical, uneven way, as if he had done it himself without much care, and a light stubble shadowed his jaw. A faint scar traced along the edge of his right eyebrow, not deep but permanent, a quiet reminder of a past he rarely allowed himself to revisit. His eyes were a muted blue-gray, sharp, constantly moving, scanning every angle of the environment even when there was nothing to see. It was a habit that never left him, not after years as a Navy SEAL. But behind that sharpness lived something else, something distant, as if part of him was always somewhere else, somewhere louder and harder to escape. He wore a red-black plaid flannel shirt over a dark, worn t-shirt, the fabric stiff from cold and use, layered beneath an old winter jacket that had seen better years. His jeans were faded and rough at the knees, and his boots carried the marks of long miles on unforgiving ground. One gloved hand rested loosely against his thigh, fingers occasionally tightening with a faint tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. In the other, he held nothing. There was no coffee, no warmth, no comfort left to hold. Beside him lay Coda, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat dulled by dirt and snow. His body was large, powerful even in its current state, but his ribs showed faintly beneath the fur, a sign that the past few weeks had not been easy. His ears stood upright, alert, and his amber eyes moved constantly, watching the world with disciplined focus. Coda had the posture of a trained working dog, controlled, steady, and silent, but there was a quiet exhaustion in him that mirrored Stellan's. Still, there was nothing broken in the way he held himself. He remained ready, attentive, loyal to a fault. His breathing came out in soft white bursts against the cold air, steady and controlled, never panicked, never weak. Stellan's hand rested lightly against the side of Coda's neck, not petting him, not soothing, just maintaining contact, something real in a world that had grown increasingly distant. In front of them sat a small paper bag, crumpled and nearly empty. Stellan reached into it slowly, pulling out the last remaining piece of food, a cold, half-stale sandwich that had long lost any trace of warmth. He stared at it for a moment, his jaw tightening slightly, as if weighing something that shouldn't have required thought. Then he lowered his hand and placed the food in front of Coda. The dog did not move immediately. His eyes lifted to Stellan's face, searching, waiting. Coda did not eat without permission, not even now. That discipline had been built over years, reinforced through training and trust. Stellan gave the faintest nod. That was enough. Coda lowered his head and began to eat, not frantically, not desperately, but in a controlled, measured way that spoke more of training than hunger. Even so, The speed at which the food disappeared revealed more than his behavior allowed. Stellan watched without expression, his gaze distant, unfocused, as if he were looking through the moment rather than at it. A couple passed by on the sidewalk across the parking lot, their coats pulled tight, their steps quick. They glanced once in Stellan's direction, then quickly looked away, continuing without slowing. A truck rolled past the road nearby, tires crunching over snow, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene before disappearing into the night. No one stopped. No one spoke. That was how it always went. Stellan leaned his head back against the cold brick wall of the diner behind him, his eyes drifting toward nothing in particular. The sign above the building flickered faintly, casting a weak glow over the snow-covered ground. Inside, through fogged windows, warm light spilled outward. Shadows moved, people talking, laughing, eating, belonging. The sound didn't quite reach him, but the difference between inside and outside was clear enough. Koda finished eating and lifted his head, licking the last traces of food from his muzzle. He did not look around immediately. Instead, he shifted slightly closer to Stellan, pressing his side gently against the man's leg. It was subtle, but intentional. Stellan felt it. His fingers tightened briefly against the dog's fur before relaxing again. Then Koda's ears shifted forward. The movement was small, precise, but unmistakable. His attention locked onto something near the diner door. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply watched. Stellan noticed immediately. His body straightened just slightly, instinct pulling him forward. His gaze followed the direction of Koda's focus. The diner door opened with a soft chime. A woman stepped out into the cold. At first, there was nothing unusual about her presence. Just another person leaving the warmth of the diner. But then Stellan noticed the pace. Slow, deliberate, unhurried in a way that didn't match the temperature or the night. Harriet Vale was 93 years old, though there was little about her that suggested fragility. She stood just under 5 feet tall, her frame thin but steady, wrapped in a long, dark wool coat that reached down past her knees. Her white hair was pulled back neatly into a low bun, every strand in place despite the wind. Her face carried deep lines etched by time, but her eyes were clear, sharp, and unwavering, holding a quiet strength that did not belong to someone nearing the end of life. She held a simple wooden cane in her right hand, though she did not lean heavily on it. It was more companion than necessity. Harriet had spent decades watching people. Years ago, her husband had returned from war a different man, quieter, distant, carrying something he could not name. She had learned, slowly and painfully, how to recognize that same distance in others. It was not something most people saw. It required patience, attention, and a willingness to look beyond what was easy to ignore. Her gaze moved across the parking lot, taking in the snow, the road, the dim lights, and then it landed on Stellan. And stayed there. Stellan felt it immediately. Most people looked away the moment their eyes met his. Not her. There was no hesitation, no discomfort, no judgment, just recognition. It made something shift in him, subtle but undeniable. He looked down, expecting the moment to pass. It didn't. Tap. The sound of her cane touched the pavement. Tap. Closer. Stellan frowned slightly, glancing up again. She was walking toward him, not around him, toward him. Koda remained still, but his eyes followed her every step. There was no aggression in his posture, only awareness. That alone was enough to keep Stellan from reacting too quickly. Harriet stopped beside the empty chair across from him. For a moment, she simply stood there, snow settling lightly on her coat. Then, without asking, without hesitation, she pulled the chair out and sat down. Just like that. Stellan blinked once, caught off guard in a way he hadn't been in years. His instincts searched for explanation, for pattern, for anything that made sense of this situation. There was none. He cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. "Ma'am, it's cold, you shouldn't..." She raised a hand slightly, cutting him off, not rudely, just firmly. "I've been in colder," Harriet said calmly. There was no boast in her tone, just fact. She turned her head slightly toward the diner door and spoke, her voice steady, but carrying enough to be heard inside. "Could someone bring 2 hot meals out here, please?" Inside, a young waitress paused near the counter, clearly confused. She was in her early 30s, with light brown hair tied back loosely and a tired but kind face. Her name tag read Lena. She hesitated for a moment, glancing between Harriet and Stellan, uncertainty visible in the way she held herself. Stellan shook his head slightly. "I don't have money for that." Harriet didn't look at him. Good thing I do. The simplicity of the answer left no room for argument. Stellan exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face. Pride stirred, familiar but weaker than it once had been. He said nothing more. A few minutes later, the door opened again and Lena stepped outside, carefully carrying 2 plates. Steam rose into the cold air, the scent of hot food cutting through everything else. She approached cautiously, setting the plates down on the table. "There you go," she said softly, her voice gentler now. Stellan stared at the plate in front of him. "Go on," Harriet said. He didn't move right away. Then, slowly, he picked up the fork. The first bite hit him harder than expected, not because of the taste, but because of what it meant. Warmth. Care. Something he had not allowed himself in a long time. Coda remained close, his body pressed lightly against Stellan's leg. Harriet watched quietly, her expression calm, but there was something deeper there. Not pity, not sympathy. Understanding. For a long moment, no one spoke. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the edges of the world. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Stellan Cross did not feel completely invisible. Morning came to Ashford Ridge slowly, not with sunlight, but with a pale gray sky that seemed to press down over the town. The storm had softened into a fine, drifting snowfall that coated everything in a quiet stillness. The parking lot outside the diner looked different in daylight, less mysterious, but no less cold. The tracks from the night before half buried beneath fresh snow. Stellan Cross had not left. He stood near the side of the building, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, his breath steady in the air. The same red-black flannel rested beneath his jacket, stiff from the night, and his boots were damp from standing too long in snow that refused to melt. Coda stood beside him, his posture more stable than it had been the night before, though the signs of fatigue had not fully disappeared. His coat looked marginally better under daylight, but the thinness beneath it remained. Still, his ears were upright, his gaze alert, tracking movement with the same disciplined focus. The diner door opened, and Lena Hartwell stepped out, balancing a small metal bin filled with trash. In daylight, she looked different than she had the night before, more defined, more tired. Lena was 34 years old, average height with a slender build that spoke of long hours on her feet rather than careful exercise. Her light brown hair was tied into a loose ponytail, a few strands escaping and framing her face. Her features were soft, but there was a constant tension around her eyes, the kind that came from responsibility carried alone for too long. She had been raising her son on her own since he was 3, after his father had left without much explanation. That experience had shaped her into someone practical, cautious, and slow to trust anything that felt uncertain. She paused when she saw Stellan still there. "You didn't leave," she said, her voice neutral but not unfriendly. Stellan gave a slight nod. "Didn't have anywhere else to go." Lena shifted the bin slightly, studying him for a moment longer than necessary. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Coda, then back to Stellan. "You planning on staying out here all day?" He shrugged faintly. "Not sure yet." She hesitated, then let out a small breath. "We are short on help in the mornings." She tilted her head toward the diner. Dishes, cleaning, nothing complicated. Stellan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture adjusted slightly, a subtle shift toward attention. "In exchange?" "Food," she said. "And maybe a little cash if you don't mess anything up." It wasn't charity. That mattered. He nodded once. "All right." Inside, the warmth hit him immediately, sharp and unfamiliar after the night outside. Conversations dipped just slightly as he walked in, not enough to stop entirely, but enough to notice. People glanced, then looked away, some quicker than others. Stellan ignored it. Coda stayed close at his side, moving with quiet precision, his paws barely making a sound against the worn floor. Behind the counter stood Douglas Pike, the owner of the diner. He was in his early 50s, thick-set with broad shoulders and a heavy presence that filled the space around him. His hair, once dark, had faded into uneven streaks of gray, and his jaw carried a permanent shadow of stubble. His eyes were sharp, calculating, the kind that assessed a person in seconds and rarely changed their opinion after that. Years of running a small-town diner had made him wary of anything that looked like trouble. He looked at Stellan and frowned. "We don't run a shelter." "Not asking for one," Stellan replied, his voice steady. Douglas crossed his arms. "Then what are you asking for?" "Work." There was a pause, the kind that stretched just enough to make it clear the answer mattered. Lena stepped in. "Just dishes. We're backed up." Douglas didn't look at her. His gaze stayed locked on Stellan. Then, after a moment, he jerked his head toward the back.
"Kitchen's through there. You cause a problem, you're out."
Stellan nodded once. Understood. The kitchen was smaller than expected, crowded with stacks of plates, utensils, and the lingering heat of constant use. Stellan rolled up his sleeves and stepped to the sink without hesitation. The work was simple, repetitive, almost mechanical. Water ran, plates were scrubbed, rinsed, stacked, over and over again. For a while, it was enough. Coda settled near the back door, positioning himself where he could see both the kitchen and part of the main dining area. He lay down slowly, but his eyes remained open, tracking movement with quiet vigilance. The hours passed without much incident until the door at the side of the diner opened again. A boy stepped in hesitantly, brushing snow from his jacket. He looked around quickly before moving toward a corner table. His name was Ethan Hartwell. He was 10 years old, thin for his age, with messy dark blonde hair that fell unevenly across his forehead. His shoulders were slightly hunched, not from the cold but from habit, as if he had grown used to making himself smaller in crowded spaces. His clothes were clean but worn, a jacket a size too big, jeans slightly faded at the knees. His eyes were a muted blue, but they rarely held focus for long, shifting away quickly whenever someone looked at him. School had not been kind to him. Quiet kids often became easy targets, and Ethan had learned early that drawing attention usually meant trouble. He slid into his seat without speaking, pulling a small notebook from his backpack and opening it. A pencil moved across the page, quick, practiced. Drawing. It was the one thing he did without hesitation. Coda noticed him almost immediately. The dog's head lifted slightly, ears angling forward. He watched the boy for a moment, assessing. There was no threat, no tension, just something familiar, something quiet. Ethan felt it after a few seconds, the sensation of being watched. He glanced up, his eyes landing on Coda. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then Coda shifted, rising slowly to his feet. His movements were controlled, deliberate. He walked forward a few steps, stopping a short distance from the boy's table. Not too close, not intrusive, just present. Ethan froze at first, his fingers tightening around the pencil. Large dogs weren't something he was used to, but there was no aggression in Coda's posture. No raised fur, no tension in his stance, just calm. The boy swallowed slightly, then held out his hand, uncertain, stopping halfway as if unsure he should continue. Coda stepped closer. He lowered his head just enough for the boy's hand to reach. Ethan's fingers brushed against the thick fur along Coda's neck. The contact was light, hesitant at first, then a little firmer. Coda didn't move away. Something shifted in the boy's expression. Not a smile exactly, but something softer, something that hadn't been there when he walked in. From the kitchen, Stellan noticed. He didn't stop working, but his eyes flicked toward the interaction. He watched for a moment, something subtle passing across his face. Recognition maybe, or memory. Lena appeared near the table a minute later, setting down a plate in front of Ethan. She paused when she saw Coda. Her gaze moved quickly to Stellan. "Your dog's not causing trouble, is he?" Stellan shook his head slightly. "No." She looked back at Ethan, then at Coda again. The boy hadn't pulled away. That alone was enough to ease her concern. "All right," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Ethan glanced up at her. "He's okay," he said softly. Lena studied her son for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, like she was seeing something she hadn't expected. "Eat your food," she replied, but her voice had softened. Back in the kitchen, Douglas leaned slightly towards Stellan. "Kid doesn't usually talk much," he muttered. Stellan didn't answer. Douglas crossed his arms again, watching the boy for a moment longer. "If that dog keeps him calm, I'm not complaining." Stellan rinsed another plate, water running over his hands. "He's trained." Douglas gave a short nod, as if that explained everything. The day moved on, but something had changed. Ethan finished his meal slower than usual, his attention split between his food and the dog beside him. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated for a moment, then reached out once more, giving Coda a quick, careful pat. Coda remained still, watching him. The boy grabbed his backpack and headed for the door, shoulders still slightly hunched, but not quite as much as before. Stellan watched him go. Then he returned to the sink. The rhythm resumed. Water, plates, silence. But this time, it felt different. The afternoon settled over Ashford Ridge in a dull, heavy gray, the kind of light that made time feel slower than it really was. Snow no longer fell in thick sheets, but a fine powder drifted across the streets, carried by a low wind that moved quietly between buildings. The town had returned to its usual rhythm, small, contained, predictable, but there was something different in the way Stellan Cross stood behind the diner that day. He did not look like someone passing through anymore. He looked like someone deciding whether to stay. His hands moved steadily as he stacked the last of the clean dishes, the repetitive motion still grounding him in a way nothing else did. Water ran over his fingers, cold at first, then warming as the sink filled. The tremor in his hand had not disappeared, but it had softened, less sharp, less constant. Coda remained near the back door, his posture relaxed but alert, his amber eyes shifting between the kitchen and the faint movement beyond the glass. He had eaten. He had rested. There was a little more strength in the way he carried himself now. Stellan stepped outside when the work slowed, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. The air bit harder than it had in the morning, the wind sharper now, cutting across the open space behind the diner. He leaned against the wall for a moment, eyes scanning out of habit, taking in the quiet streets, the distant shapes of houses lining the edge of town, and the narrow road that led out toward the hills. The diner door opened behind him. Harriet Vale stepped out slowly, her cane tapping lightly against the frozen ground. In daylight, the lines on her face seemed deeper, more defined, but her eyes remained the same, steady, observant, carrying that quiet certainty that unsettled Stellan more than anything else. She wore the same dark wool coat, buttoned carefully, her white hair still neatly gathered at the back. "You're still here," she said. Stellan gave a small nod. "For now." She studied him for a moment, then turned her gaze toward the road. "That's longer than most people expect from someone in your position." He didn't respond. The wind moved between them, filling the silence with something that didn't feel uncomfortable, just present. Harriet shifted her grip on the cane. "Would you mind driving me home?" she asked after a moment. "The walk's a bit longer than I'd prefer today." Stellan hesitated for only a second. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." His truck sat at the far edge of the lot, an older model pickup, paint faded and chipped, with a thin layer of snow still clinging to the hood. It started after a brief pause, the engine turning over with a low, steady rumble. Harriet climbed in slowly, deliberate in every movement, but without fragility. Coda settled in the back seat, his presence quiet, watchful. They drove in silence for a while. Ashford Ridge passed by in small pieces, a hardware store, a closed gas station, a row of houses with smoke rising faintly from chimneys. It was a town that had learned to survive winter by staying still. Harriet's home stood at the far end of a narrow road lined with tall pine trees. The house itself was small, older than most of the others in town, with pale siding that had begun to peel in places, and a front porch that leaned slightly to one side. Snow had gathered unevenly along the roof, and the steps leading up to the door were partially buried. Stellan noticed everything. The loose railing, the gap along the edge of the door frame, the slight sag in the porch floor. It wasn't a house falling apart, not yet, but it was getting close. Harriet unlocked the door and stepped inside, moving carefully but without hesitation. Stellan followed, pausing just inside the entryway. The air was warmer than outside, but only slightly. The heat was there, but not strong. Inside, the house was clean, but simple. Furniture worn from years of use, a small table near the window, a chair placed just so beside it. Everything had its place. Nothing was unnecessary. It was the kind of home maintained by someone who had learned to do everything alone. Harriet set her cane aside and removed her coat, folding it neatly over the back of a chair. "You can come in," she said, as if the invitation had been obvious all along. Stellan stepped further inside, his eyes still moving, assessing without thinking. Coda remained near the door at first, then slowly followed, his paws quiet against the wooden floor. Harriet moved toward the small kitchen area, her movement steady. "There's tea," she said, "if you want it." Stellan shook his head slightly. "I'm fine." She glanced at him, then gave a small nod, as if she had expected that answer. For a few moments, there was only the sound of water heating, the quiet hum of something old but still working. Stellan's gaze drifted again to the window, to the faint line where cold air seemed to slip through the edges. He walked over without saying anything, running a hand lightly along the frame. "Draft," he said. Harriet didn't look surprised. "Yes." He pressed gently against the wood. It shifted slightly under his hand. "Seal's worn." "I assumed as much," she replied calmly. Stellan stepped back, his mind already moving through what needed to be done. "You got tools?" "In the shed," she said. That was enough. The shed sat just behind the house, half covered in snow but still accessible. Inside, the tools were older but well kept, arranged with care. Stellan picked out what he needed without hesitation. Hammer, nails, a small roll of insulation material that had likely been sitting there for years. He worked without speaking. The rhythm came back quickly, the same focus he had carried into every task before. Precise, controlled, efficient. He reinforced the loose frame, sealed the gap, adjusted the hinge that had begun to shift. Each movement was deliberate, practiced. Inside, Harriet watched from her chair near the window. She did not interrupt. She did not thank him. She simply observed, her expression unreadable but attentive. Coda remained near the doorway, his posture relaxed but present, his eyes occasionally shifting toward Harriet, then back to Stellan. There was no tension in him now, only quiet awareness. By the time the light outside had begun to fade, the worst of the problems had been addressed. Stellan stepped back from the doorframe, testing it once more. It held. He wiped his hands on his jeans, glancing around the room again, seeing the other small things that needed attention. The loose floorboard near the corner, the uneven leg on the table, the faint rattle in the heating vent. He didn't say anything about them. Harriet spoke instead. "You don't have to fix everything." Stellan shrugged slightly. "Wasn't planning to." She studied him for a moment longer. "But you were going to try." He didn't answer. The silence settled again, but it felt different now, less distant. After a moment, Stellan stepped toward the door. "I should get back." Harriet nodded once. "Of course." He reached for the handle, then paused briefly, his hand resting against the wood. "You should get that heater checked," he said. "It's working, but not right." "I know," she replied. Another pause. Then he opened the door and stepped back out into the cold. Coda followed immediately, moving at his side as naturally as breathing. The sky had darkened again, the gray turning slowly toward night. Snow continued to fall, light but steady, covering the footprints they had left behind. Stellan didn't look back at the house, but something had shifted. Not in the town, not in the weather, in him. Morning in Ashford Ridge came with a sharper cold than the days before, the kind that settled into the bones before a person even stepped outside. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the town buried under a thick, untouched layer of white that reflected the pale light of dawn. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys, thin and quiet, and the streets remained mostly empty except for a few early vehicles moving carefully over the frozen roads. The world felt still, almost suspended, as if waiting for something to shift. Stellan Cross arrived at the diner before the lights inside had fully warmed the windows. His truck came to a stop in the same corner of the lot, but this time he did not hesitate before stepping out. His movements were more certain now, less like a man deciding whether to stay and more like someone who had already made a temporary choice. The red-black flannel beneath his jacket looked cleaner, though still worn, and his posture carried a steadier balance than before. The fatigue in his face had not disappeared, but it no longer seemed to weigh as heavily. Coda stepped down beside him, his paws sinking slightly into the fresh snow. His coat, once dulled by dirt and weather, had begun to regain a faint sheen, the black and tan more defined under the morning light. His movements were stronger, his stance more grounded, but his attention remained sharp, ears flicking at every distant sound, eyes scanning with quiet discipline. He walked close to Stellan, not out of dependence, but out of habit built over years of working side by side. Inside the diner, the air was warmer than usual, filled with the early sounds of preparation. Lena Hartwell moved between tables, wiping down surfaces and setting up for the morning rush. She looked up as Stellan entered, her expression neutral at first, then shifting slightly, as if she had expected him but hadn't fully admitted it to herself. There was less hesitation in her gaze now, though the caution had not disappeared entirely. "You're early," she said. Stellan gave a small shrug. "Didn't have anything else to do." Lena nodded, setting a stack of menus in place. "Coffee's fresh," she added after a moment, almost as an afterthought. He hesitated, then walked toward the counter and poured himself a cup. The warmth of it in his hands felt unfamiliar in a way that was hard to explain. He didn't drink it right away. He just stood there, holding it, as if reminding himself what it felt like to have something steady. Coda settled near the same spot by the back door, lowering himself slowly to the floor, his body relaxed but his eyes alert. He had already mapped the space in his mind, knowing where everything was, where people moved, what sounds belonged and what didn't. The bell above the front door chimed softly. Ethan Hartwell stepped inside, brushing snow from his jacket as he closed the door behind him. He looked the same as the day before, thin, quiet, shoulders slightly drawn inward. But there was a difference in the way his eyes moved. They didn't stay fixed on the floor this time. Instead, they shifted toward the back of the diner almost immediately, toward Coda. He hesitated for only a second before walking in that direction. Coda noticed him the moment he entered, lifting his head slightly, ears angling forward. There was no tension in his posture, only recognition. He remained where he was, allowing the boy to approach. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his fingers gripping the strap of his backpack. His gaze moved between the dog and the floor, as if he were trying to decide whether this was still allowed, whether yesterday had been real or just a brief moment that wouldn't repeat. Coda stood up slowly. He took one step forward, then another, closing the distance just enough to remove the uncertainty. His movement was controlled, deliberate, never sudden. Ethan reached out again. This time, his hand didn't stop halfway. His fingers pressed gently into the thick fur along Coda's neck, and when the dog didn't pull away, something shifted more clearly in the boy's expression. A small breath escaped him, almost like relief. From behind the counter, Lena watched. She didn't interrupt. She didn't call Ethan back. Instead, she leaned slightly against the edge of the counter, her arms crossing loosely as she studied the interaction. There was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. Something softer, something cautious but hopeful. She had seen her son retreat into himself over the past year, speaking less, avoiding eye contact, carrying a weight no child should have to carry alone. Seeing him reach out, even like this, mattered more than she was ready to admit. Stellan noticed it too. He stood a short distance away, his hands wrapped loosely around the coffee cup, his gaze steady but not intrusive. He didn't step in. He didn't speak. He understood, without needing explanation, that some things couldn't be forced. Ethan crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Coda's level. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Coda tilted his head just slightly, watching him. The boy's hand moved again, more confident now, tracing along the dog's shoulder. "He's not like other dogs," Ethan said after a moment, glancing briefly toward Stellan. Stellan set the cup down on the counter. "He listens," he replied simply. Ethan nodded, as if that answer made sense. There was a pause, then he spoke again, quieter this time. "Kids at school, they don't listen." Lena's posture stiffened slightly at the counter, though she didn't turn around. Stellan's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze sharpened. "What do they do?" Ethan shrugged, his shoulders lifting and falling quickly. "Just stuff." He didn't look up. "They take my things, push me around. It's not a big deal." It was. Stellan knew that without needing more detail. He had seen that kind of dismissal before, the way people minimized what hurt, because saying it out loud made it real. Coda shifted slightly, pressing closer to the boy's side, not in defense, but in presence. Ethan didn't pull away. Stellan stepped closer, just enough to be part of the conversation without overwhelming it. "You tell anyone?" Ethan shook his head. "Why not?" The boy hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Doesn't change anything." Stellan didn't respond right away. He studied the boy for a moment, seeing more than what was being said. The posture, the avoidance, the quiet acceptance. "Maybe," Stellan said finally, "but staying quiet doesn't change anything either." Ethan didn't answer, but his hand remained on Coda, fingers gripping the fur slightly tighter. From the counter, Lena turned just enough to speak. "Breakfast," she called gently. "Come sit." Ethan stood slowly, giving Coda one last glance before moving to the table. His shoulders were still slightly hunched, but not as much as before. Coda watched him go, then returned to his spot near the door, settling down again. The diner began to fill slowly as the morning progressed. A few regulars came in, boots leaving tracks across the floor, voices low and familiar. Some glanced at Stellan, some didn't. The tension that had been there before had lessened, not gone, but quieter. Stellan moved through his tasks without being told. He wiped down tables, checked the hinges on the back door, adjusted a loose latch without drawing attention to it. Each action was small, but deliberate, a continuation of the same instinct that had led him to fix Harriet's house. Douglas Pike watched from behind the counter. He didn't say anything at first. He just observed, arms crossed, eyes narrowed slightly. Then, after a while, he stepped closer to Lena. "Kid talked more today," he muttered. Lena didn't look at him. "Yeah." Douglas nodded once. "Dog's doing something right." Lena allowed herself a faint, almost invisible smile. "Maybe it's not just the dog." Douglas didn't argue. Outside, the light shifted slowly, the gray softening as the day moved forward. Snow began to melt slightly along the edges of the road, revealing patches of dark pavement beneath. Inside, something else was changing. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to matter. The afternoon light over Ashford Ridge dimmed earlier than expected, swallowed by a thick layer of low clouds that pressed heavily against the mountains. The snow that had begun to melt in the morning now hardened again into a thin, unforgiving crust along the streets. Wind moved through the narrow gaps between buildings, carrying a sharper edge than before, rattling loose signs and brushing against the diner windows with a faint, persistent sound. Inside Maple Diner, the warmth held steady, but something else had settled into the room, something quieter, tighter, like tension waiting for a reason to surface. Stellan Cross stood near the sink, finishing the last of the afternoon dishes. His movements were the same as always, controlled, deliberate, each plate rinsed and stacked with practiced efficiency. The rhythm had become familiar now, almost grounding. But there was a subtle shift in him, the way his shoulders held a fraction more tension, the way his eyes moved more often toward the front of the diner. It was not fear. It was instinct, the kind that never left. Coda lay near the back door, his body relaxed but not fully at ease. His head rested lightly on his paws, but his ears flicked at every new sound, his gaze lifting every few seconds to scan the room. The improvement in his strength was clear now, his coat fuller, his posture stronger, but his awareness had not softened. If anything, it had sharpened. Ethan Hartwell sat at his usual table, a plate half finished in front of him, his notebook open beside it. His pencil moved across the page, sketching quietly, occasionally pausing as he glanced toward Coda. There was less hesitation in him now, less of the shrinking posture he had carried before, though the habit had not disappeared entirely. His shoulders were still slightly rounded, but not as tightly drawn inward. Lena Hartwell moved between tables with steady focus, her pace quick but controlled. She seemed more at ease than in the days before, though her attention drifted toward Ethan more often than she realized. Checking. Always checking. Years of raising him alone had taught her to notice small changes, the ones others would miss. Douglas Pike stood behind the counter, wiping down the same section longer than necessary. His eyes moved across the diner, measuring the room as he always did, but there was less resistance in the way he looked at Stellan now. Still cautious, still guarded, but no longer dismissive. The door slammed open. Cold air rushed in, sharp and sudden, cutting through the warmth of the diner and pulling every head toward the entrance. The man who stepped inside did not match the quiet rhythm of the place. Randy Crow was in his mid-40s, broad and heavy-set, his build thick but uneven, like a man who had once been stronger but had let it fade. His dark hair was unkempt, pushed back roughly, and his face carried a permanent flush that came from years of drinking too much and sleeping too little. A patchy beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, slightly glassy but still focused, moved across the room with a slow, deliberate intensity that made people uncomfortable without him needing to say a word. He wore a heavy coat that hung loosely on his frame, the fabric worn at the edges, and his boots tracked slush across the floor as he stepped further inside. There was a reason people in Ashford Ridge avoided him. Randy had grown up in the town, had never left, and had built a reputation not through anything impressive, but through persistence. He was loud when others were quiet, confrontational when things didn't go his way, and he had a way of making small problems feel larger than they were. Not dangerous enough to be feared openly, but enough to make people step aside when he entered a room. Douglas straightened behind the counter. "Not today, Randy," he said, his voice firm but controlled. Randy smirked faintly, brushing snow from his coat. "Relax, Doug. I'm just here for a meal." His gaze moved past Douglas, drifting slowly across the diner until it landed on Harriet Vale. Harriet sat at her usual table near the window, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly over the top of her cane. She looked as she always did, composed, steady, untouched by the shifting mood of the room. The lines on her face remained calm, her eyes clear as they lifted to meet Randy's. She did not look away. That alone seemed to irritate him. "Well," Randy said, stepping closer, his boots heavy against the floor. "If it isn't Harriet Vale. Still out and about like nothing's changed." Harriet's voice came evenly. "Good afternoon, Randy." No fear, no hesitation. Randy's smile tightened slightly. "You always did have that tone," he muttered. "Like you're better than everyone else." The room had gone quiet. Lena had stopped mid-step, a plate still in her hand. Ethan's pencil hovered above the page, unmoving. Douglas shifted his weight forward slightly, ready, but not yet acting. Stellan's hands stilled at the sink. He didn't turn immediately, but his focus sharpened, every detail of the room pulling into place. The angle of Randy's stance, the distance between him and Harriet, the way the air had changed. Coda was already on his feet. He moved without sound, stepping forward just enough to position himself where he could see both Randy and Stellan. His body was not aggressive, but the tension had returned, quiet and controlled. Randy took another step closer to Harriet's table. "You think people don't talk?" he said, his voice rising just slightly. "You think they don't notice things?" Harriet did not react. Her silence seemed to press against him more than any words could have. Randy's hand came down against the table with a sharp, sudden force. The sound echoed through the diner. Ethan flinched. Lena set the plate down quickly, her movements tighter now, her eyes flicking between Randy and her son. Douglas took a step forward. "That's enough," he said. But Randy didn't look at him. His focus remained locked on Harriet. "Say something," he pushed, leaning in slightly. "Or is that what you do? Just sit there and act like none of this matters?" Harriet's voice remained calm. "It only matters as much as you let it." That was the line. Randy's expression shifted, the irritation sharpening into something more unstable. He reached forward, not striking, but crossing a line that didn't need explanation, his hand moving toward the edge of her table. Stellan moved. There was no hesitation. 2 steps, controlled, fast. His hand closed around Randy's coat near the collar, pulling him back with enough force to break the forward motion instantly. The movement was precise, efficient, the kind that came from training that never fully left. "Back off," Stellan said, his voice low and steady. The room froze. Randy's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something uncertain. He turned his head slightly, looking at Stellan properly for the first time. "Easy there," Randy muttered, though the confidence in his tone had weakened. Stellan didn't respond. For a moment, something shifted in his eyes, something deeper, older. The room seemed to narrow, the sound fading slightly as his focus locked onto the threat in front of him. His grip tightened just enough to make Randy feel it. It would have been easy, too easy. Coda stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive. He pressed his head lightly against Stellan's leg. The contact was small, but deliberate. Stellan's breath caught for just a fraction of a second. And that was enough. The tension broke. The room returned. The sound of breathing, the faint clink of dishes, the cold air still lingering near the door. Stellan loosened his grip. Then he let go. Randy stumbled back, catching himself against a nearby chair. His eyes moved quickly between Stellan and the rest of the room, calculating, reassessing. The arrogance had not disappeared, but it had cracked. He straightened slowly. "This isn't over," he muttered, though the edge had dulled. Douglas stepped forward, his voice firmer now. "It is for today. Get out." Randy held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and pushed the door open, letting the cold air rush in again before disappearing into the snow. Silence followed. Then movement. Lena exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly. Ethan looked toward Stellan, something new in his expression. Not fear, not uncertainty, something closer to admiration, though he didn't yet have the words for it. Harriet remained seated, unchanged. She looked at Stellan. "Thank you," she said simply. Stellan didn't answer. He stepped back, creating distance, his breathing steadying again, his hands loosening at his sides. The moment passed, but something remained. Not the tension, the choice. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Ashford Ridge had not expected, not from a man like Stellan Cross. Winter still held the town in its quiet grip, but the storms had eased into something more manageable, thin snowfalls that came and went without warning, leaving the streets layered but no longer buried. The mornings arrived pale and cold, the afternoons dim and short, and the nights stretched long across the mountains. Life in the town continued the way it always had, but there was a subtle shift now, something small but persistent, like a change in direction that only became visible over time. Stellan arrived early each day, often before the lights inside the diner had fully warmed the windows. His truck would roll into the same corner of the lot, engine cutting off with a steady hum, and he would step out without hesitation, boots crunching against the packed snow. The red-black flannel had become a constant, layered beneath his jacket, worn but cleaner now, cared for in a way it hadn't been before. His posture carried more balance, less of the inward weight that had once defined every movement. The past had not left him, but it no longer controlled every step he took. Coda moved beside him with renewed strength. His coat had regained its healthy sheen, the black and tan clear under daylight, his frame filled out, muscles defined again beneath the fur. His presence had shifted as well, not just watchful now, but grounded, confident. He still tracked every movement, every unfamiliar sound, but there was less tension in it, more certainty. He knew where he was, he knew his place. The diner had begun to adjust to Stellan's presence. Douglas Pike no longer watched him with the same guarded suspicion. The skepticism had not disappeared entirely, but it had worn down under consistency. Stellan showed up, he worked, he didn't argue, didn't complain, didn't draw attention to himself. He fixed what needed fixing without being asked, tightening loose hinges, reinforcing shelves in the back, clearing ice from the walkway before anyone else arrived. The kind of work that spoke louder than explanations ever could. "You're early again," Douglas muttered one morning, though there was no bite in it. Stellan shrugged slightly. "Snow builds up if you let it sit." Douglas glanced toward the cleared entrance, then back at him. He gave a short nod, as if acknowledging something he wasn't ready to say out loud. "Coffee's on the house," he said, almost as an afterthought. It wasn't charity, it was recognition. Inside, Lena Hartwell moved through her routine with a steadiness that had returned slowly over the past few days. She still carried the weight of responsibility in the way she worked, quick, efficient, always aware of everything around her, but there was less strain in her expression now. Her trust did not come easily, shaped by years of having to rely on herself, but she had begun to see Stellan for what he was, not a problem, not a risk, but someone who kept his word. Ethan Hartwell had changed the most. He still entered the diner quietly after school, brushing snow from his jacket, his shoulders still slightly drawn inward, but he no longer went straight to the corner table without looking up. His eyes searched the room first, not for danger, but for something else. For Coda. The dog would lift his head the moment the boy stepped inside, recognition immediate, and Ethan would walk toward him without hesitation now. The distance between them had disappeared, replaced by something steady and simple. Ethan would sit on the floor beside him sometimes, notebook in hand, sketching while his free hand rested absent-mindedly against Coda's side. "You're getting better," Stellan said one afternoon, standing nearby as the boy drew. Ethan glanced up, unsure at first. "At drawing?" Stellan shook his head slightly. "At standing up straight." The boy hesitated, then shifted his shoulders back just a little, testing it. It felt unfamiliar, but not wrong. "Some kids tried to mess with me yesterday," Ethan said after a moment, his voice quieter, but not as uncertain as before. Stellan's attention sharpened. "What happened?" Ethan shrugged, but there was something different in it now. "I didn't let them take my stuff." He looked down at the page, then back up. "They didn't like that." "No," Stellan said. "They wouldn't." Ethan's hand rested against Coda's fur. "But I didn't move." Stellan gave a small nod. "That matters." Lena had been watching from the counter. She didn't interrupt, but something in her expression softened, relief mixed with a cautious kind of pride. She had seen the boy come home quiet too many times, his confidence worn down piece by piece. This was different. Small, but real. Later that afternoon, Harriet Vale stepped into the diner, her presence as calm and deliberate as always. The room seemed to adjust slightly when she entered, not out of obligation, but out of quiet respect. She moved to her usual table, her cane tapping lightly against the floor, her posture unchanged despite the cold outside. Coda noticed her immediately. He rose from his position near the door and walked toward her without hesitation. There was no caution in his movement this time, only recognition. He stopped beside her chair, standing still, his tail giving a slow, measured movement. Harriet looked down at him, her eyes softening just slightly. "Well," she said quietly, "you've decided I'm acceptable." Coda remained where he was. Ethan watched from across the room, his eyes moving between the two. There was curiosity there now, and something else, understanding beginning to take shape. Stellan approached a moment later, stopping near the table. Harriet glanced up at him. "You've been busy," she said. He shrugged faintly. "Things needed fixing." "Not all of them," she replied. Stellan didn't answer. Harriet studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something she had already known. "That's how it starts," she said. "How what starts?" he asked. She rested her hands over the top of her cane. "Belonging." The word lingered longer than it should have. Stellan looked away briefly, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the snow-covered street beyond. Belonging had never been something he planned for. It wasn't something he trusted. And yet, he was still here. Outside, the light had begun to fade again, the sky shifting toward a darker gray. The town continued its quiet routine, unaware of the small changes happening within it. Inside the diner, Stellan returned to his work, his movement steady, his focus clear. Coda settled back near the door, his eyes half-lidded but still aware. Ethan returned to his drawing, his posture just a little straighter than before. Lena moved between tables, her steps lighter, her attention no longer pulled in as many directions at once. Douglas watched it all from behind the counter. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to, because the change was visible, not in words, in presence. And for the first time since he had arrived in Ashford Ridge, Stellan Cross was no longer just passing through. He was becoming part of something. The sky over Ashford Ridge cleared for the first time in days, revealing a pale winter sun that hung low over the mountains, casting long shadows across the frozen streets. The air was still cold, sharp enough to sting the lungs, but the absence of falling snow made the town feel different, more open, less confined. It was the kind of morning that suggested change, even if nothing had visibly shifted yet. Stellan Cross noticed it the moment he stepped out of his truck. The silence was lighter. The weight in his chest was not gone, but it had eased in a way he didn't fully trust yet. His boots crunched over the hardened snow as he moved toward the diner, his breath steady, his posture more upright than it had been when he first arrived. The red-black flannel rested clean beneath his jacket, the fabric worn but cared for, like everything else in his life had slowly begun to be. Coda stepped beside him, his gait confident, his head held higher now. The strength had returned fully to his frame, his coat thick and healthy, his eyes sharp but no longer strained. He still watched everything, still tracked movement with quiet precision, but there was a calm in him now, something grounded. Inside the diner, the morning carried its usual rhythm. Lena Hartwell moved between tables, her pace steady, her expression focused but no longer strained. She looked up as Stellan entered, giving a small nod that had become routine. It was no longer hesitation, it was acknowledgement. Ethan Hartwell sat at his table near the window, notebook open, pencil moving across the page. His posture had changed noticeably over the past week. His shoulders were straighter, his movements less guarded. The quiet was still there, but it no longer felt like something closing him off from the world. It felt like something he chose. Douglas Pike stood behind the counter, arms crossed, watching the room as he always did. His gaze flicked briefly toward Stellan, then away again. Not dismissive, not cautious, just aware. The day moved forward without disruption. Until the phone rang. The sound cut through the diner, sharp and clear. Douglas reached for it, answering with a short, practiced tone. "Maple Diner." He listened for a moment, then glanced toward Stellan. "It's for you." Stellan paused, his hand stilling on the counter. For a second, he didn't move. No one called him anymore. Not here. He walked over slowly, taking the receiver. "Yeah?" There was a brief silence on the other end, then a voice came through, calm, controlled, familiar in a way that pulled something tight inside him. "Didn't think you'd pick up." Stellan's expression didn't change, but his grip on the receiver tightened slightly. "Victor." Victor Shaw was in his mid-40s, a former SEAL like Stellan, but where Stellan had withdrawn, Victor had stayed in the structure of it. He had transitioned into private security work, maintaining the discipline, the control, the sense of purpose that came from always having a mission. He was the kind of man who carried authority without raising his voice, someone others followed without question. His hair had gone short and gray at the edges, his face lined with experience, but steady, grounded. He had been a leader once, and in many ways, he still was. "Got something for you," Victor said. "Security contract, private sector, good pay, clean work." Stellan leaned slightly against the counter, his gaze drifting toward the window. "I'm not looking." "You weren't looking last time either," Victor replied. "Didn't stop you from being good at it." Stellan didn't answer. Victor continued, his tone unchanged. "It's stable, rotation schedule. You don't have to keep moving around like this." Stellan's eyes shifted toward Coda, who sat near the door, watching him. "How long?" Stellan asked. 6 months to start," Victor said. "Could turn into more." 6 months. Long enough to disappear again. Victor spoke again, quieter this time. "You can't stay out there forever, Stellan." The words settled heavier than they should have. Stellan exhaled slowly. "I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking," Victor said. The line went quiet. Stellan hung up without another word. For a moment, he remained where he was, the receiver still in his hand, his mind moving through something he hadn't allowed himself to consider since arriving in Ashford Ridge. A way out. A way back. The diner moved around him, voices rising and falling, plates clinking, the normal rhythm continuing as if nothing had changed. But something had. Lena watched him from across the room. She didn't ask. She didn't interrupt. But she noticed. Ethan glanced up from his notebook, sensing the shift even if he didn't understand it. Coda remained still, his gaze fixed on Stellan, his posture attentive in a different way now. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Stellan moved through it differently. His actions remained precise, controlled, but there was a distance in them again, a slight separation between what he was doing and where his mind had gone. That evening, the light outside faded into a deep blue-gray, the town settling once more into its quiet night. Stellan sat in his truck, engine off, the cold pressing in slowly as the heat from earlier disappeared. The diner lights reflected faintly on the windshield, casting a soft glow across the interior. Coda sat beside him, unmoving, waiting. Stellan stared ahead, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. 6 months. Good pay. Structure. Everything he had once relied on. His gaze shifted slightly, catching the reflection of the diner window. Inside, he could see movement, Lena clearing tables, Douglas behind the counter, Ethan sitting with his notebook, Coda's usual place by the door now empty. Something tightened in his chest. Not pressure, something else. The truck remained still. Minutes passed. Then the driver's side door opened. Stellan stepped out, the cold hitting him immediately, sharp but grounding. Coda followed without hesitation, moving at his side as they crossed the parking lot. Inside, the warmth returned, along with the quiet familiarity that had begun to build over the past days. Harriet Vale sat at her usual table. She looked up as Stellan approached, her expression unchanged, her eyes clear. "I might be leaving," he said. There was no hesitation in the words this time. Harriet studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Then you should." Stellan frowned faintly. "That's it?" She tilted her head just enough to hold his gaze. "You don't owe this place anything." The simplicity of it caught him off guard. "You don't owe me anything," she added. The words settled deeper than expected, because they removed the one excuse he hadn't admitted to holding. Stellan looked away briefly, his gaze drifting across the diner, taking in the small details he hadn't noticed before. The worn edges of the tables, the quiet movement of Lena. Ethan's head bent over his notebook, Coda standing steady at his side. He exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said. The decision wasn't made yet, but it was closer. The morning over Ashford Ridge arrived clear and still, the storm finally gone, leaving behind a sky-washed pale blue and a town that looked almost unfamiliar beneath the sunlight. Snow covered everything in quiet layers, but for the first time in days, the light cut through cleanly, reflecting off rooftops and frozen roads with a sharp, steady glow. It was the kind of morning that made everything visible, nothing hidden, nothing softened. Stellan Cross stood outside the diner, in the same place where he had once sat with nothing left but a cold night and a dog that depended on him. His breath rose slowly in the air, steady, controlled. The red-black flannel rested beneath his jacket, worn but clean, the fabric fitting differently now, not because it had changed, but because he had. His shoulders were squared, not rigid, not tense, just balanced. The weight he carried had not disappeared, but it no longer dragged him downward with every step. Coda stood beside him, his posture calm and grounded, his coat thick and healthy under the morning light. The strength in him had fully returned, but more than that, there was a quiet certainty in the way he moved, the way he watched. His gaze moved between Stellan and the world around them, no longer searching for danger at every moment, but still ready if it came. He had adjusted, just as Stellan had. The diner door opened behind them, the sound soft against the quiet morning. Lena Hartwell stepped outside, wrapping her arms lightly against the cold. She paused when she saw Stellan already there, her expression shifting slightly, something unspoken passing across her face. She had seen people come and go in this town her whole life, most of them leaving without a word, without a reason anyone else could understand. But Stellan didn't feel like someone disappearing. He felt like someone deciding. "You heading out?" she asked. Stellan didn't answer right away. His gaze remained on the street ahead, the sunlight catching along the edges of the snow. "I got a call," he said finally. Lena nodded once, as if that confirmed something she had already expected. "Good job?" "Yeah," he replied. "Good pay. Stable." "That sounds like something you'd want." "It used to be." The words settled between them. Lena studied him for a moment longer. She didn't push, didn't ask anything else. She had learned that some decisions weren't meant to be talked through, not out loud. "Whatever you choose," she said quietly, "just make sure it's yours." Stellan gave a small nod. Behind them, the diner door opened again, and Ethan stepped outside, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw Stellan, hesitation flickering briefly across his face before he walked closer. His posture was different now, more upright, more certain, though the quiet in him remained. "You leaving?" Ethan asked. Stellan looked down at him, then at Coda, who had already shifted slightly closer to the boy without thinking. "Maybe," Stellan said. Ethan nodded slowly, as if he understood more than the word suggested. He reached down, resting a hand against Coda's neck, his fingers moving through the thick fur with familiarity now. "He'll be okay?" he asked, though it wasn't clear if he meant the dog or the man. "Yeah," Stellan said. "He will." Ethan looked up, holding his gaze for a second longer than he might have before. "So will you," he said. The simplicity of it landed deeper than anything else. Ethan stepped back, adjusting his backpack. "I gotta go," he added, then turned toward the road, walking with a steadier stride than he had when Stellan first met him. Lena watched him go, then glanced back at Stellan. "That's because of you," she said. Stellan shook his head slightly. "He did that himself." "Maybe," Lena replied, "but he didn't start alone." The diner door opened once more. Harriet Vale stepped outside, her cane tapping lightly against the ground. She paused near the doorway, taking in the morning, then walked slowly towards Stellan. Her presence was the same as always, calm, steady, unchanged by the passing days. "Beautiful morning," she said. Stellan nodded. "Yeah." She stopped beside him, her gaze following his out toward the road. "Good day for decisions." He exhaled slowly. "I guess so." Harriet turned her head slightly, her eyes settling on him. "Have you made yours?" Stellan didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted again, this time toward the diner window, where reflections moved faintly across the glass. He could see pieces of the past few days layered over that reflection. The work, the silence, the small changes that had built into something more than he had expected. Then he looked back at the road. "No," he said. "Not yet." Harriet nodded once. "Then you still have time." The moment settled quietly. Then something moved at the edge of Stellan's vision. A man sat alone at one of the outdoor tables near the side of the diner. He hadn't been there moments before, or maybe Stellan hadn't noticed him. Either way, his presence stood out now. He was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered but slouched forward, his posture heavy with something that wasn't physical. His clothes were clean but worn, his hands resting loosely on the table, his gaze fixed on nothing. There was a stillness in him that felt familiar, too familiar. The kind of stillness that came when someone had run out of direction. Coda noticed him at the same time. The dog stepped forward without hesitation, his movement calm, deliberate. He walked across the snow toward the man, stopping a few feet away, watching him the way he watched everything that mattered. The man looked up slowly, his expression shifting from distant to confused, then to something softer, something uncertain. Stellan followed. He didn't think about it. He didn't weigh the decision. He just moved. He pulled out the chair across from the man and sat down, his posture steady, his presence quiet but firm. No introduction, no explanation, just there. The man blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Do I know you?" he asked. Stellan shook his head. "No." The man frowned slightly, glancing toward Coda, then back at Stellan. "Then why are you—" "Because someone did it for me," Stellan said. The words came without hesitation. The man didn't respond right away. He didn't have to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was different now. Harriet watched from a distance, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that suggested this was exactly what she had expected all along. Lena stood near the door, her arms loosely folded, observing without interrupting. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood enough. Coda settled beside the table, his body relaxed, his presence steady. Stellan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze calm. The road, the job, the past, they were still there, but for the first time, they weren't pulling him away. They were just options. And here, in this moment, he had already chosen something else. Sometimes miracles do not come with thunder or signs in the sky. They arrive quietly through people who choose to see us when the world looks away. Stellan did not need his past erased. He needed to be reminded that he was still worthy of a future. And God often works in that exact way, placing the right person in our path at the moment we are ready to stop running. Harriet was not just a kind stranger. She was an answer sent at the right time. In our daily lives, we pass by people carrying battles we cannot see. A small act of kindness, a moment of patience, or simply choosing to sit beside someone instead of walking away can change everything. You never know when God is using you to become that turning point in someone else's story. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe in quiet miracles and second chances, type Amen in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope and healing. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your path every day.